The day I almost lost my granddaughter to people who had never once loved her. I was standing in my kitchen making oatmeal. That is where this story begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office with mahogany furniture and cold coffee. Right there in my kitchen, on a Tuesday morning in late October, stirring a pot on the stove, while the world outside my window was still deciding whether to wake up. I did not know yet what was coming. Nobody ever does. The oatmeal was the real kind, 20 minutes on the stove, stirred every few minutes or it sticks. Lily would not eat the instant kind. She said it smelled wrong. And after 8 years of raising her alone, I had stopped questioning which things she needed and simply provided them. That is what you learn, eventually. You stop trying to change the shape of the child and start learning the shape they already are. Lily was 15 years old that October. She had Asperger's, which meant the world came at her differently than it came at most people. Louder, sharper, harder to filter. She was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. Still on the surface, but moving constantly underneath. She woke every morning at 5:45 without an alarm, went straight to her desk upstairs, and was already working by the time I came down to make breakfast. The blue glow of her monitor was always the first light I saw when I looked up at the ceiling from the kitchen. I did not fully understand what she was building up there. What I did understand was that the day before, a man named Gerald Park had called my landline and told me her work was worth $1 million. I will say that again, because I need you to understand what those words meant to a retired bus route manager from the south side of Chicago. $1 million. I had written his number on the notepad by the phone, the one with the pen on a string my wife had put there in 1994 and that I had never taken down, not in all the years since she passed. I had stood in the hallway for a long time after hanging up, listening to Lily's keyboard overhead, thinking about a folded piece of paper sitting in the top drawer of my oak desk in the study. A patent, filed in 1998. A hardware design for acoustic noise filtration, something I had worked out during night shifts when the newer bus models were causing problems for the mechanics. The patent office had approved it in '99. Nothing had ever come of it. No company, no manufacturer, no licensing deal. 26 years of silence. I had nearly thrown it away a dozen times. Something had always stopped me. Standing in that hallway the night before, listening to my granddaughter's keyboard, and holding a notepad with a phone number that represented more money than I had ever seen in my life, I began to understand why. But that morning, stirring the oatmeal, I was not yet thinking about patents or phone calls or million-dollar software programs. I was thinking about the morning 8 years earlier, when everything in my life had quietly rearranged itself around a 7-year-old girl with a pink duffel bag. Sandra had not called ahead. She never did. She appeared at my front door on a September evening with Lily standing beside her, staring at the doorstep the way she always stared at things that troubled her with total concentration, as though if she looked hard enough, the thing would eventually explain itself. Sandra wore that expression I knew from when she was a teenager, caught in something she could not talk her way out of. Defiance and shame, layered together, each one making the other worse. She said she needed a few weeks to sort things out. She was gone before I finished showing Lily where the bathroom was. The few weeks became 8 years. Her calls came less and less, until they stopped completely, somewhere around Lily's 10th birthday. I stopped waiting for them around the same time. A man can only hold a door open so long before he accepts that nobody is coming through it. So it was just the two of us. 8 years of oatmeal and AM radio and the blue glow under Lily's door. 8 years of learning which lights were too bright and which sounds were too sharp and which silences were comfortable and which ones meant she was struggling. 8 years of making mistakes and correcting them and making different mistakes, and learning those too. I spooned the oatmeal into 2 bowls, sliced half a banana into Lily's always half, always thin, never any other fruit near it. Set both bowls on the table and called up the stairs. The keyboard stopped. She came down in her gray sweatshirt, hair pulled back, eyes still carrying the particular inward quality they always had in the morning. She sat in her chair by the window, always the same chair, and pulled her bowl toward her without looking up. We ate in the quiet that had become our language, and sitting there, watching her eat one careful spoonful at a time, I thought about Gerald Park's phone number on that notepad, about the patent in the drawer, about the shape forming slowly in the fog at the back of my mind. Something I could not yet see clearly, but could feel was important. I did not know that in less than 30 days, a woman I had not seen in 8 years would be standing at my front door again. And this time, she would not be alone. There is something nobody tells you about raising a child with Asperger's when you are 67 years old and have never done anything like it before. They do not tell you that the hardest part is not the meltdowns, not the sleepless nights, not the school meetings where people use words like intervention and specialized placement in the careful tone of people who have already made up their minds. Those things are hard, but they are not the hardest part. The hardest part is the loneliness of not knowing if you are doing it right. There is no manual. There is no one to call at 10 o'clock at night when Lily has been screaming for 40 minutes because the tag in her shirt is touching her neck wrong and nothing you do is making it better. And you are standing outside her bedroom door with your forehead pressed against the wood, just breathing, just trying to hold yourself together long enough to be useful to her. There is no one who can tell you whether you are helping or making it worse. You just have to stay. That is all. You just have to keep staying. I learned that in the first winter, Lily had been with me about 3 months when it happened. The worst night of those early years. It was February, bitter cold, the kind of Chicago cold that gets into the walls of the house and stays there. She had come home from school and gone straight upstairs without eating, which was not unusual. But around 8 o'clock, I heard a sound from her room that I had not heard before. Not crying exactly, something past crying. A sound that a person makes when words have completely failed them and the body has taken over. I went upstairs and knocked. She did not answer. I opened the door slowly and found her sitting on the floor between her desk and the wall, rocking, her hands pressed flat against her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. I did not know what to do. Every instinct I had said to go to her, to put my arms around her, to do what you do when a child is in pain. But I had read enough by then to know that touch could make it worse, that what felt like comfort to me might feel like an additional assault to her. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I sat down on the floor across the room from her, and I did not move. I just sat there, in the cold, on the hardwood floor that was not kind to the knees of a 67-year-old man. I sat there and I breathed slowly, and I let her know by my presence alone that she was not alone in whatever she was going through. It took 40 minutes. Gradually, the sound softened. The rocking slowed. Her hands came down from her ears. She did not look at me. But after a while she reached out and placed one hand, very lightly, on the floor between us. Not touching me, just reaching in my direction. I put my hand on the floor too. Close, but not touching. We sat like that for another 20 minutes. Then she got up, went to her desk, sat down, and started working on something, like nothing had happened, like the last hour had been simply a weather event that had passed through and moved on. I went downstairs to the kitchen and sat at the table and put my face in my hands and cried in a way I had not cried since my wife's funeral. Not from sadness, Exactly. From something more complicated than that. From the weight of it. From the understanding that this was going to be the work of my remaining years and that I had no idea if I was equal to it. From the loneliness of being the only person in the world responsible for a child who needed more than I knew how to give. But I did not leave. That is the thing I want you to understand. I did not leave. Not that night, and not any of the nights that followed. A man makes a choice, and then he makes it again every single day until it is no longer a choice, but simply who he is. The years move the way years do when you are busy, faster than you expect, and slower than you wish. Lily started at a new school the following fall, a smaller one with a teacher named Mrs. Patterson, who understood her in ways the previous school had not. Things did not become easy, but they became more navigable. Lily found her footing in the structured predictability of her days. I found mine in learning hers. She discovered computers the summer she turned 11. I cannot tell you exactly how it happened, because I did not witness the beginning of it. One day she was spending her afternoons reading encyclopedias, actual printed encyclopedias, the ones my wife had bought in 1988 that still sat on the shelf in the study. And then one day, she was not. She had found the old desktop computer I kept in the study for paying bills and had quietly taken it over. Within 2 weeks, she had exhausted everything it could teach her. I bought her a better one. Second-hand, from a shop on Halsted Street. But better. She sat in front of it for 12 hours the first day without eating, and I had to bring a sandwich upstairs and set it beside the keyboard without speaking. And she ate it without looking away from the screen. Within a month, she was asking me questions I could not answer. About processors, about memory architecture, about something called algorithmic efficiency that I did not even know was a thing an 11-year-old could be thinking about. I did not pretend to understand. I just kept buying her what she needed. That was what I could do. I could not follow her into the world she was building inside that machine. But I could make sure she had the tools to keep building it. A man works with what he has. I had a pension, a paid-off house, and the willingness to go without things so she would not have to. It was around that time that I found myself in the study one afternoon, looking for a document in my old oak desk. And I pulled open the wrong drawer and found the patent instead. I had not looked at it in years. I unfolded it carefully and read it the way you read something from a part of your life that feels like it belonged to a different person. The filing date, the technical description, the diagrams I had drawn by hand on drafting paper during night shifts at the depot, working out the mathematics of sound filtration in the margins of bus maintenance logs. I folded it back up and put it in the drawer, but I did not put it in the bottom drawer, where the truly forgotten things lived. I put it back in the top drawer, closer to hand. I could not have told you why. By the time Lily was 13, the house had found its rhythm. Not the rhythm of an ordinary household. I want to be clear about that. Nothing about our life together was ordinary in the conventional sense. There were still difficult days. Days when the world came at her too hard, and she needed the lights turned low and the radio off, and the house to become as quiet as possible while she recalibrated. Days when I said something in the wrong tone without realizing it, and she went silent in a way that told me I had made an error I did not yet understand. Days when I drove her to school and watched her walk through the front door and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes afterward, just breathing, just hoping the day would be kind to her. But there was a rhythm underneath all of it, a steady, reliable pulse that belonged to the two of us and nobody else. Mornings were oatmeal and the AM radio and Lily's keyboard overhead before I even came downstairs. Afternoons were her work and my garden and the quiet companionship of two people who had learned to share space without requiring anything from each other they could not genuinely give. Evenings were dinner at 6, always at 6, because Lily's internal clock was a precise instrument that did not appreciate improvisation. And then her back upstairs and me in the living room with whatever book I was working through. And eventually, the house going dark and quiet and both of us sleeping. Sundays I made a proper breakfast. Eggs and toast and orange juice. No substitutions. Lily ate it in the particular focused way she ate everything, giving the food her complete attention, as though it required analysis. Sometimes she talked during Sunday breakfast. Not about feelings or school or the kinds of things children in movies talk to their grandparents about. She talked about what she was working on. Fragments of information delivered in the precise language of someone who does not see the point of simplifying things for an audience that has not done the necessary reading. I listened to every word. I understood perhaps 1 word in 5. But I listened, because here is what I learned about Lily over those years. And this took me a long time to understand, so I want to say it carefully. When Lily talked to you, she was not making conversation. She was not filling silence or being polite or doing the social thing that people do when they sit across a table from someone. When Lily talked to you, she was sharing something she considered important. And if you did not listen, really listen, not just nod and wait for your turn to speak, she would know. She always knew. And she would not share again for a long time. So I listened, and somewhere in those Sunday morning fragments, in those technical descriptions I could barely follow, I began to understand that my granddaughter was doing something genuinely extraordinary up in that room. She had started building software the summer she turned 12. Not games, not simple programs, something more serious than that. She had explained it to me in pieces over several months, always at Sunday breakfast, always in her careful, precise way. She was working on a program that filtered sound. Specifically, a program that could identify and isolate unwanted acoustic interference in audio recordings and remove it without degrading the quality of the primary sound. Noise filtration software. I had nodded and asked my limited questions, and filed the information away in the part of my mind I reserved for things I did not fully understand but recognized as significant. It was not until much later, not until Gerald Park's phone call, in fact, that I sat down and really thought about what she had described, about the specific technical problem she had been solving, about the approach she had taken, which Gerald Park had described in enough detail for me to recognize it, even through my layman's understanding. She had been working from a principle of hardware-based acoustic filtration, the same principle I had worked out by hand on drafting paper during night shifts at the depot in 1998. I do not know exactly when she found the patent. I suspect it was one of those afternoons when she wandered into the study looking for something in the encyclopedias and found the oak desk unlocked and the top drawer accessible. Lily did not snoop in the way that some children do, not out of mischief or curiosity about things that were not her business. But if she found a technical document in a place where technical documents lived, she would read it. Of course she would read it. And if the principle it described was interesting to her, she would remember it with the perfect fidelity that her mind applied to everything she considered worth keeping. She had never mentioned it to me. I had never mentioned it to her. And so for 3 years, without either of us knowing it, we had been building something together. She with her code upstairs, and me with my old patent in the drawer below. And the thing we had built together, without speaking a word about it, was about to become worth more than either of us had ever imagined. But before any of that could matter, something else was going to happen first. Roy Simmons called me on a Friday afternoon in early November, 2 weeks after Gerald Park's call, while I was in the backyard pretending to tend the garden. Roy and I had been friends since the early 90s, back when he was driving Route 47 and I was the dispatcher who kept his schedule from falling apart. He had retired a few years before I did, And somewhere in the years since, he had picked up a private investigator's license, which suited him in ways that bus driving never quite had. Roy was the kind of man who noticed things. It was his primary gift, and occasionally his primary problem. He said he had heard something. Said a name had come up in a conversation he was having with a contact of his downtown. A lawyer's name. He asked me if I knew anyone named Trent Caldwell. I told him I did not. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Earl, I need you to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you." And something in the way he said it, something in the particular quality of the quiet that came before it, told me that the shape I had been seeing in the fog for the past 2 weeks was about to come into focus, and that I was not going to like what it looked like. Roy told me what he had heard, in the careful way he always delivered difficult information. Slowly, with pauses between the important parts. Like a man laying down stones across a river, and making sure each one was solid before he stepped to the next. Trent Caldwell was a corporate attorney based in the Loop, 45 years old, partnership at a firm called Caldwell and Associates, the kind of practice that had its name on a glass door on the 32nd floor of a building where the elevator required a key card. On paper, Trent Caldwell was exactly what his business card said he was: successful, established, the kind of man who wore his confidence like a second suit. But Roy's contact had told him something that did not appear on any business card. Trent Caldwell owed money, a significant amount of money. Not to a bank, not to a business partner, not to the kind of creditor you could negotiate with over coffee. He owed it to people whose patience operated on a different timeline than the laws, and whose methods of collection did not involve paperwork. The number Roy mentioned was somewhere north of $700,000. I stood in my backyard with the phone against my ear and looked at the garden I had been pretending to tend, and said nothing for a moment. Then I asked Roy how this connected to me. He said he was not entirely sure yet, but Caldwell's name had come up in the same conversation as the name ClearPath Technologies, the company that had called me about Lily's software. Roy's contact did not know the details of the connection, but in Roy's experience, when two names appeared in the same sentence in certain kinds of conversations, it was not coincidence. I thanked him. He told me to be careful. I told him I was always careful. He said that was not entirely true, which was fair. After I hung up, I stood in the yard for a long time. The October light was already going thin by 4 in the afternoon, the way it does in Chicago as the year winds down, like the sun is rationing itself for winter. The garden looked the way it always looked this time of year, past its best, the last of the season's effort spent, waiting for the cold to come and finish what the autumn had started. I had never been a particularly skilled gardener. My wife had been the one with the talent for growing things. I kept at it because the habit of it connected me to her in a way I was not willing to give up. I thought about what Roy had said. I thought about Gerald Park and his careful, measured voice, and his $1 million offer. I thought about the patent in the drawer, and then I thought about something I had been avoiding thinking about since the moment Gerald Park had called something that had been sitting at the edge of my mind for 2 weeks, like a letter I did not want to open. How had ClearPath Technologies found out about Lily's software? Lily did not have a public profile. She did not use social media. She did not attend conferences or submit her work to competitions or share it with anyone outside this house. She was 15 years old, and she communicated with the outside world on her own strict terms, which meant very rarely and only when she chose to. The idea that a technology company had simply stumbled across her work through ordinary channels did not hold together when I examined it. Someone had told them, someone who knew about the software and understood its value, and had a reason to make sure the right people found out about it at the right time. I went back inside, hung up my coat, and climbed the stairs to Lily's room. I knocked twice, always twice, never once, never 3 times, because she needed the pattern to be consistent, and waited. She said, "Come in." She was at her desk, of course. 3 monitors now. I had bought the third one 6 months ago, when she explained, in her precise Sunday morning way, that the work had expanded beyond what 2 screens could efficiently contain. The room smelled like warm electronics, and the particular brand of unscented soap she would accept, and nothing else. She had arranged everything in the room according to a logic that was entirely her own, and that I had learned not to disturb. I sat down on the edge of her bed, which she permitted as long as I did not move anything. I told her about Gerald Park's call. I had been waiting for the right moment, and I understood now that the right moment had arrived not because things were about to get better, but because they were about to get considerably more complicated. She listened without turning from her screens. That was her way. She took in information facing forward, processing it against whatever else was already running in her mind. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me one question. She asked if I had told anyone else about the call. I told her no. She nodded once, the small, definitive nod that meant she had filed the information and reached a conclusion I was not yet privy to. Then she turned to her keyboard and typed something I could not see from where I was sitting. And the room filled again with the sound of her working. I sat on the edge of her bed for another minute. Then I said, quietly, that I needed her to promise me something. I needed her to promise me that she would not share her password with anyone. Not Gerald Park. Not anyone from ClearPath Technologies. Not anyone who came to the house asking questions about her work. No one. Not until I told her it was safe. She stopped typing. She turned her chair slowly. The way she moved when something had her full attention and looked at me directly. Which she did not do often. Which told me she understood that what I was saying was serious. She said, "I know, Grandpa." Just that 3 words. And the way she said them, with the calm certainty of someone who had already considered the situation from every angle and arrived at the same conclusion I had told me something I had not expected. She already knew something was wrong. She had known before I did. I nodded and stood up from the bed carefully. At the door, I stopped and looked back at her. She had already turned back to her screens. The blue light caught the side of her face, and she looked older than 15 in that moment. She looked like someone who had been paying very close attention to the world for a long time and had learned not to be surprised by what it showed her. I pulled the door closed behind me and stood in the hallway for a moment. Downstairs, the notepad by the phone. Gerald Park's number written in my handwriting. The pen on the string my wife had put there 30 years ago. Upstairs, my granddaughter and her 3 monitors and a password that only she knew. And somewhere out there, a man named Trent Caldwell with a $700,000 debt and a plan I did not yet fully understand. The quiet of the house felt different now. Not the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms. Something tighter. Something that was holding its breath. I went downstairs and put the kettle on, and I started thinking. She came on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of November. I knew something was wrong before I opened the door. Not because of any particular sound or sign, just that particular stillness that settles over a house when something outside it is about to change everything inside it. I had been drinking my 2nd cup of coffee at the kitchen table, watching the bare trees on Millbrook Avenue move in the cold wind, when the doorbell rang. I want to tell you what it felt like to see Sandra standing on my porch after 8 years. I want to tell you, but I am not sure I have the right words for it. It was not quite anger. It was not quite grief. It was something that combined the 2 and added something else on top. A particular weariness, the kind that comes not from being surprised, but from having always known, somewhere in the back of your mind, that this moment was going to arrive eventually. That the world does not let certain things stay unfinished forever. She looked different. Older, obviously. But it was not just the years. She had the look of a woman who had made a series of choices that had each seemed reasonable at the time and had added up to something she had not intended. Her clothes were expensive in a way that Sandra's clothes had never been when she was younger. Not elegant expensive, but effortful expensive. The kind that is trying to communicate something. And behind her, standing one step down on the porch, was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. He had the face of a man who had spent a long time being the smartest person in most rooms he entered, and had arranged his features accordingly. Controlled, pleasant, giving away nothing. He was holding a leather briefcase in his left hand. His right hand was in his coat pocket. Sandra said my name. She said it the way people say things they have been rehearsing too even, too prepared. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at the man behind her. Then I said, "Sandra, who is this?" She told me his name was Trent. Her husband. I had not known she had a husband. I looked at Trent Caldwell, and Trent Caldwell looked at me, and we understood each other immediately, in the way that two people sometimes do when they are standing on opposite sides of something. I did not invite them in. I stood in the doorway, and I listened to what Sandra had to say. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she had made mistakes. She used that word in the smooth, practiced way of someone who has been coached on how to acknowledge wrongdoing without actually accepting responsibility for it. She said she understood that Lily had been through a lot, and that she was grateful for everything I had done. But that she was Lily's mother, and she felt it was time for them to reconnect. She said she and Trent had a good life, a stable home, and that they wanted what was best for Lily. She said all of this without once asking how Lily was. She did not ask what Lily was studying, or how she was doing in school, or whether she had friends, or what she liked to eat for breakfast. She talked about Lily the way you talk about a piece of furniture you left at someone's house, as something that belonged to you and that you were ready to collect. I kept my face still. 30 years of managing bus routes had taught me that, if nothing else, how to keep your face still when the situation requires it. Trent had not said anything yet. I looked at him. He looked back with that controlled pleasantness of his, the kind that is actually a form of pressure if you know how to read it. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope. He held it out to me and said, in a voice that was professionally warm and professionally final at the same time, that he wanted to make sure I had the opportunity to review some documents before things proceeded further. He said they were simply informational at this stage. He said there was no need for things to become adversarial. I took the envelope. I did not open it. I told them I would be in touch. Sandra looked like she wanted to say something else. Trent put his hand lightly on her arm, not affectionate, directional, and they turned and walked back down the porch steps to a black sedan idling at the curb. The car pulled away smoothly and quietly, the way expensive things do. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, holding the envelope. Then I heard the keyboard stop upstairs. A few seconds later, Lily appeared at the top of the stairs. She had a way of knowing when something significant had happened in the house, even when she had not witnessed it directly. She looked at the envelope in my hand. She said, "Was that my mother?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is she coming back?" I looked up at her, standing at the top of the stairs, in her gray sweatshirt, her face carrying that particular stillness, not cold, not unfeeling, but measured, precise, like someone who had already run the calculation and was waiting to see if my answer matched the result. I told her I did not know yet. She nodded once. Then she went back to her room, and the keyboard started again. I went to the kitchen and sat down at the table and opened the envelope. Inside were 12 pages of legal documents. Motion for reinstatement of parental custody, filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County, Family Division. Sandra Mercer, petitioner. The grounds cited were extensive: my age, my fixed income, my lack of formal training in special needs care. There was a psychiatric evaluation request for Lily. There was a financial disclosure demand directed at me. And at the bottom of the final page, almost as an afterthought, a reference to the software, to the pending acquisition by ClearPath Technologies, to the need for proper legal guardianship to be established before any financial transaction of that magnitude could be appropriately managed on behalf of a minor. I read that last paragraph 3 times, and there it was. Not dressed up, not hidden particularly well, just stated, in legal language, as a matter of practical necessity. They needed guardianship of Lily because Lily had something worth $1 million, and they needed to be in the right legal position to control what happened to it. I set the papers down on the table, outside. The wind moved through the bare trees on Millbrook Avenue, and the November light lay flat and gray across the kitchen floor. I thought about Sandra standing on my porch talking about reconnecting, about Trent and his envelope and his professionally warm voice, about the black sedan pulling away from the curb. And I thought about Lily, upstairs at her keyboard, working on whatever came next, trusting me the way she had learned to trust me over 8 years of mornings and oatmeal and hardwood floors and silences that meant, "I love you," because we did not have another language for it. I picked up the phone and called Roy Simmons. He answered on the second ring. I told him they had made their move. He said he had been expecting it. He said he had more information about Trent Caldwell, and that I needed to hear it in person. He said, could I come to his office tomorrow morning? I said I could. Then I went upstairs, knocked twice on Lily's door, and sat on the edge of her bed and told her as plainly as I could that some people were going to try to use the court system to change where she lived and who made decisions about her life. I told her I was going to fight it. I told her I was not going to lose. She did not turn from her screens, but after a moment she said, "I know you won't, Grandpa." And she said it with the same calm certainty she said everything else, like it was simply a fact she had already established and filed away. I nodded and said goodnight and went back downstairs, but I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house, and thought about 12 pages of legal documents on my kitchen table, and a man in a charcoal overcoat with a $700,000 debt, and a plan. And I thought about what I had that he did not. I thought about the patent. Roy Simmons had his office on the second floor of a narrow building on South Wabash Avenue, wedged between a dry cleaner and a place that sold musical instruments and had been going out of business for as long as I could remember. The building had an elevator that worked intermittently and stairs that always did. And I took the stairs because at 75 I had learned to trust reliable things over convenient ones. His office was small and organized in the particular way of a man who knows exactly where everything is and does not require it to look neat to anyone else. 2 filing cabinets, a desk, 3 chairs, a window that looked out onto the elevated train tracks. Every few minutes the train went by and the whole room shook slightly. And Roy never noticed anymore. The way you stop noticing things that have been part of your life long enough to become background. He had coffee waiting, the real kind, from a percolator on a shelf behind his desk. Roy Simmons had opinions about coffee that he shared freely and at length, and I had long ago stopped arguing with them because he was right. I sat down and he sat across from me, and we drank our coffee for a moment, in the way that old friends do, not filling the silence, just occupying it together before the serious business began. There was something settling about that, something that reminded me of the early 90s when Roy was driving Route 47 and I was the dispatcher keeping his schedule from falling apart. We had drunk bad coffee together in worse offices than this one, and gotten through harder mornings than this one. That history was present in the room with us, and I was grateful for it. Then he opened a folder on his desk and told me what he had found. Trent Caldwell had been a successful attorney. That part was true. For about 12 years. He had built a legitimate practice in corporate law, the kind of work that involved contracts and mergers and the careful movement of large sums of money between entities whose names most people had never heard. He had been good at it. He had a reputation. He had made real money and had spent real money and had built the kind of life that looked, from the outside, like everything a man was supposed to want. Roy paused there and refilled both our cups. He said the trouble with men like Trent Caldwell was not that they were stupid. The trouble was that they were smart enough to get themselves into situations that stupider men would never have attempted, and not quite smart enough to get themselves back out. About 8 years ago, Trent had begun taking on a different kind of client. Not obviously, not all at once. It had started with one introduction through a contact, one transaction that had been framed as complicated but legal, one fee that was larger than anything his legitimate practice had ever generated, and then another, and then another. The work involved moving money through shell companies and real estate transactions, and the layered structures that make funds of unclear origin look clean by the time they arrive somewhere respectable. For a while, it had worked exactly as advertised. Trent had gotten paid well, and had believed, as people in those situations always believe, that he was too careful and too intelligent to be caught. He had told himself the story that sophisticated people tell themselves when they are doing something they know is wrong, that the rules were made for other people, that his situation was different, that he would stop when he had enough. He had not stopped. And then one of his clients had decided that Trent's fee on a particular transaction had been too generous to himself. This was not a client who expressed disagreement through formal complaint or civil litigation. This was a man named Victor Caruso, who operated out of a legitimate-looking import business in Cicero and whose methods of resolving financial disputes did not involve paperwork. There had been a confrontation. Money had been demanded back. Trent had not had it. He had spent it, invested it, moved it into the life he and Sandra were constructing together. On the North Shore, the house, the cars, the clothes, the particular performance of success that requires constant maintenance and constant cash. The debt had grown. Interest, in Caruso's world, was not a percentage point or two above prime. It was whatever Caruso decided it was, recalculated at intervals that suited him and no one else. By Roy's accounting, based on what his contacts had pieced together from various sources over the past 2 weeks, Trent Caldwell currently owed somewhere between $700,000 and $900,000. I set my coffee cup down carefully. Roy watched me take that in. He did not rush past it. He understood that certain numbers need a moment of silence around them before anything else can be said. I asked how long Caruso had been waiting. Roy said over a year. He said Caruso was not a patient man by nature, but was a strategic one. He had been watching Trent exhaust his options one by one, selling assets, borrowing against the house, liquidating investments, and had allowed it because a man with fewer and fewer options is a more cooperative man than one who still believes he has a way out. But Caruso's patience was not unlimited, and Trent knew it. I looked out Roy's window at the elevated tracks. The morning was gray and flat, the kind of November morning in Chicago that does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. A train went by, loud and close, shaking the window in its frame. Then it was gone, and the silence came back. I thought about Sandra on my porch, about the practiced smoothness of her voice, about Trent standing one step behind her with his leather briefcase and his envelope, letting her deliver the human part of the message while he held the legal part in reserve. It had been a performance, carefully staged. Sandra as the mother who wanted her child back. Trent as the reasonable husband supporting his wife's reasonable wish. And underneath all of it, a debt that was running out of time. I asked Roy when he thought Trent had found out about Lily's software. Roy said he believed it had been about 6 weeks before Gerald Parks' call to me. Sandra had heard it through a family connection, a cousin who had stayed in occasional contact over the years. The information had reached Trent, and Trent had done what Trent did, which was to immediately assess the financial architecture of the situation. A minor with an asset worth $1 million. A biological mother with a legitimate legal claim to guardianship. A husband who happened to be an attorney who knew exactly how to file the right motions in the right court at the right time. Roy closed the folder and looked at me steadily. He said, "Earl, the call from ClearPath Technologies was not a coincidence. Trent arranged it. He needed the offer on the table and documented before the guardianship filing so that the court would have a clear picture of the financial asset at stake. He needed the $1 million to be real and visible before he made his move." I nodded slowly. I said, "So he built the stage before he walked onto it." Roy said, "That is exactly what he did." The train went by again. The windows shook. The coffee in my cup moved in a small circle and then went still. I asked Roy what our legal position looked like from the outside. He leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, which with Roy always meant the answer was not going to be simple or comfortable. He said, "On paper, Earl, you are not standing in a strong place." He laid it out plainly. A 75-year-old man on a fixed pension. No formal training in special needs care. No co-guardian. No legal representative currently on record. A house that was paid off, but modest. A savings account that was careful rather than substantial. Against that, Sandra Mercer, biological mother. No criminal record. Married to a man who was, on paper, a successful Chicago attorney with a legitimate practice and a North Shore address. The kind of profile that looks, in a family court filing, like stability and resources and the reasonable expectation of a better environment for a child with special needs. Trent had structured the filing carefully. The language around my age was not cruel, but it was deliberate. Every reference to my circumstances was framed as a concern for Lily's welfare rather than an attack on me personally, which made me look like the problem without making them look like the aggressor. The psychiatric evaluation request for Lily was framed as routine due diligence. The financial disclosure demand was framed as transparency in the child's best interest. It was, Roy said, a well-constructed document. I asked about the frozen assets. He said the supplementary motion had been granted 2 days after the initial filing. Any transaction related to Lily's intellectual property was currently suspended pending resolution of the guardianship question. Gerald Parks' offer was real but unreachable. The $1 million existed on paper and nowhere else until the court decided who had the authority to act on Lily's behalf. I said, "So as long as this case is unresolved, the money sits." Roy said, "That is correct." I said, "And Trent needs the money to move before Caruso loses patience entirely." Roy said, "Also correct." I said, "So he is going to push this case as fast as he can through the system." Roy nodded. He said Trent had already requested an expedited hearing schedule, on the grounds that the child's welfare was being compromised by the uncertainty of her current custodial arrangement. The court had granted a preliminary hearing date for the following month. A month was not a long time. A month was 30 days of Trent Caldwell using every tool his training had given him to dismantle 8 years of what I had built with Lily, reducing it to paperwork, to income figures and age statistics, and the cold arithmetic of what a court document could measure and what it could not. What it could not measure was the 40 minutes on the hardwood floor in February, when Lily was 9 years old, and I sat across the room and did not move, and let her find her way back in her own time. What it could not measure was the Sunday breakfasts and the 3 monitors and the banana sliced thin every morning for 8 years without exception. What it could not measure was what we were to each other. I asked Roy what he thought our strongest position was. He said, "Right now, your strongest position is time. Every week this case continues without resolution is another week Caruso is waiting. Another week the pressure on Trent builds. A man under that kind of pressure makes mistakes. He cuts corners. He overreaches. And when he overreaches in a courtroom, there are consequences." He said, "So the first thing we need to do is slow him down without appearing to obstruct. File responses that are thorough and require thorough replies. Not stalling, just being meticulous. Trent will hate it. Men in a hurry always hate meticulousness." I said that made sense. Then I told him about the patent. I explained it the way I understood it. The hardware design. The acoustic filtration principle. The night shifts and the drafting paper and the maintenance log margins. The patent office approval in '99. The 26 years of silence in the top drawer of my oak desk. And then I told him what I had figured out about Lily. That she had found the patent. That she had read it with the perfect retention her mind applied to things she considered worth keeping. That she had built her noise filtration software on the foundational principle of what that patent described. Not because I had taught her, but because she had found a technical idea that interested her and had followed it to its natural conclusion in code. Roy did not say anything while I talked. When I finished, he leaned forward slowly and put both hands flat on the desk and looked at me with an expression I had seen from him before, only rarely. Only when something had genuinely surprised him. He said, "Earl, do you understand what you just told me?" I said I thought I did. He said, "Trent walked into this assuming the asset belongs entirely to Lily, and that controlling Lily means controlling the asset. But intellectual property that derives directly from an existing patented design does not belong solely to the person who built on top of it. The patent holder has a claim, which is you. Which means Trent does not just need guardianship of Lily to get what he wants." He paused. He said, "He needs you to cooperate. And I am going to assume he has not figured that out yet." I told him Trent had not figured that out yet. I was certain of it. Roy sat back in his chair, and this time, at the edges of his expression, I saw it. That rare and particular thing, Roy Simmons, almost smiling. Roy picked up his phone and made a call, while I sat across from him and finished my coffee. He spoke briefly, in the efficient way he had when he was arranging something rather than discussing it. He gave a name, Patricia Owens, and a time, and said it was important. And then he hung up and set the phone back on his desk and looked at me. He said Patricia Owens was an intellectual property attorney he had worked with 3 years earlier, on a case involving stolen design schematics. She worked alone, out of an office on Michigan Avenue, and she had the particular quality that Roy valued above most others. In professional people, she did not say things she could not defend. He said he had asked her to meet with me the following morning. He said I should bring the patent, the original document, not a copy, and anything else I had from that period, correspondence with the patent office, technical notes, anything in my handwriting that established the timeline of the original work. I said I had the original, and I had the drafting paper. The actual sheets I had worked on during night shifts, with the calculations in the margins. Roy said that was good. He said that was very good. Then he opened his folder again and slid a photograph across the desk toward me. The man in the photograph was in his mid-30s, heavyset, with the particular kind of stillness about him that is not calm but controlled. He was standing outside a restaurant on Michigan Avenue, not looking at the camera. The photograph had been taken from a distance, with the particular grain of surveillance work. Roy said his name was Danny Farrow. He worked for Victor Caruso as a primary collector, which meant he was the person Caruso sent when he wanted someone to understand that the conversation about money was no longer theoretical. He said Farrow had been seen twice in the past 3 weeks in the vicinity of Trent Caldwell's office building. Not inside, outside, watching. I looked at the photograph for a moment. I said, Caruso is keeping an eye on his investment. Roy said, that is one way to put it. He said another way to put it was that Caruso was making sure Trent understood the timeline was not flexible. That Caruso's patience had a specific and approaching endpoint, regardless of what was happening in the Cook County family court. I handed the photograph back. Roy put it in the folder and closed it. He said, here is what concerns me. Earl, a man under the kind of pressure Trent is under, will eventually do something outside the courtroom. He has been careful so far, everything through proper legal channels, everything documented, everything defensible. But careful men stop being careful when the thing they are afraid of gets close enough. I thought about Lily upstairs at her desk, about the 3 monitors and the blue light and the keyboard that never stopped. I asked Roy if he thought Trent would come to the house again. Roy said he did not think Trent would come personally, but he said I should be aware of my surroundings. Note if anything changed on the street, if any vehicle I did not recognize appeared with regularity, if anyone came to the door asking questions about Lily or about the software under any pretext. I said I understood. I put on my coat and stood up. I told him I needed him to understand something before I left. I said, I am not a wealthy man. I cannot pay you what this kind of work is worth, and I know that. What I have is a patent from 1998 and a granddaughter who is smarter than anyone who is coming after her, and a handful of people I trust. Roy started to say something, but I held up a hand. I said, I am asking you to tell me honestly whether what I have is enough. Because if it is not, I need to know that now. I am 75 years old, and I can be wrong about this. So I need you to tell me the truth. Roy looked at me for a long moment. He said, Earl, in 30 years of doing this work, I have seen well-funded people lose cases they should have won. And I have seen people with almost nothing win cases that had no right to go their way. The difference was never the money. The difference was always whether the truth was on their side, and whether they were willing to be patient enough and careful enough to let it come out. He said, the truth is on your side. I nodded. I said thank you, and meant it in the way you mean thank you when someone has just handed you something you needed more than you realized. I drove home on surface streets instead of the expressway, not because of traffic. I drove surface streets because I needed the time. 30 years of managing bus routes had taught me that some problems could not be solved by moving faster. Some problems required the slower road, the longer way around. The extra 20 minutes of watching the city go by while your mind worked through what it needed to work through. I pulled onto Millbrook Avenue and parked in front of the house, and sat in the truck for a moment. The house looked the way it always looked from the outside. Small, neat, the kind of house that does not announce itself. The curtains in Lily's window upstairs were drawn, but I could see the faint blue pulse of her monitor behind them. She was working. Of course she was working. I went inside and hung up my coat and went to the study. I sat down at the oak desk and opened the top drawer and took out the patent and unfolded it and read it all the way through for the first time in years. Then I pulled the manila envelope from the bottom drawer and took out the drafting sheets 26 years old. yellowed at the edges. The pencil calculations still legible in the margins. The history of an idea. Written by hand during the hours between midnight and dawn, while the buses sat in the depot and the city slept. I laid the drafting sheets beside the patent and looked at both of them together. Then I folded everything carefully back into the envelope and set it at the front of the top drawer, where I would not have to search for it in the morning. Lily came down at 12:30 with the slightly dazed quality of someone returning from somewhere else entirely in their mind. She sat in her chair and ate the sandwich I had made without commenting on it, which meant it was acceptable. After a while, she looked up and said, "Did Roy have anything useful?" I told her Roy had quite a bit that was useful. I told her I was meeting with a lawyer tomorrow morning who specialized in patents and intellectual property. I told her things were moving in the right direction. She considered that for a moment. Then she said, "They think the software is only mine." It was not a question. I said, "Yes, that is what they think." She nodded slowly. She said, "But it is not only mine." I looked at her across the kitchen table. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and caught the side of her face. And she looked older than 15 in that moment. Not in a sad way. In the way of someone who had been paying very careful attention to the world for a long time. I said, "No, it is not only yours. But we are going to let them keep thinking that for a little while longer." She held my gaze for a moment, which she did rarely, and always deliberately. Then she nodded once, the small definitive nod, and went back to her sandwich. We finished lunch in the quiet that was our language, and when she went back upstairs and the keyboard started again, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and listened to the sound of it and thought that whatever was coming, we were not going into it with nothing. We were going into it with the truth, and we had the patience to wait for the right moment to use it. Patricia Owens had her office on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue that was old enough to have character and well-maintained enough to still have dignity. The elevator was original to the building, slow, brass-fitted, with a folding gate that you had to close yourself before it would move. I rode it up alone and listened to the cables, and thought about how much I preferred machinery that let you hear it working. Her office was not large, but it was exact. Everything in it had a place, and everything was in its place. The kind of order that is not performed for visitors, but maintained for the person who works there. A wide desk, 2 client chairs, a wall of filing cabinets, and a single window that looked out across Michigan Avenue toward the lake. The lake was gray that morning, the same gray as the sky, so that the horizon between them had disappeared entirely, and the water and the air had become one continuous thing. Patricia Owens was in her mid-50s. Trim, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular quality of attention that some professionals develop after years of work that requires them to listen more carefully than most people ever learn to. She stood when I came in, shook my hand with a grip that was neither aggressive nor tentative, and gestured to the chair across from her desk. Roy had called ahead and given her the broad outline. She had done some preliminary reading before I arrived. I could see a printed document on her desk that I recognized, from the format and the header, as a copy of Trent's guardianship filing. She said, "Mr. Hutchins, Roy tells me you have a patent from 1998. I said I did. I set the manila envelope on her desk, and she opened it with the care that people in her profession give to documents. Not reverently, but attentively, understanding that what looks like old paper is often something more than that. She unfolded the patent first and read it without speaking. Then she looked at the drafting sheets, one by one, holding each one at a slight angle to catch the light so she could read the pencil calculations in the margins. She took her time. I did not rush her. A man who spent 30 years managing bus routes learns that some processes cannot be accelerated without being damaged. When she had looked at everything, she set it all down and took her glasses from the top of her head and put them on and looked at the patent again for another moment. Then she said, "Tell me about your granddaughter's software. Tell me everything you understand about how it works, in whatever terms you have." I told her what I knew. The noise filtration program. The ability to identify and isolate unwanted acoustic interference in audio recordings and remove it without degrading the primary sound. The technical approach that Gerald Park had described, the hardware-based acoustic filtration principle that his company had found so valuable. I told her what I had worked out about the connection to my patent, that Lily had found the document in my desk, read it, retained it, and built her software on the foundational principle it described. Patricia Owens listened the way Roy listened, actively, assembling things behind her eyes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Hutchins, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me as precisely as you can." She said, "Are you certain that your granddaughter found your patent before she began building the software? Not after. Before." I told her I could not be completely certain of the timing because Lily had never told me directly. But I told her about the encyclopedias and the study and the unlocked desk and the years when Lily was teaching herself everything she could find. And I told her that the software Lily had built matched the principle of the patent with a specificity that, in my non-expert understanding, went beyond coincidence. Patricia nodded slowly. She said, "The reason the timing matters is this. If your granddaughter built the software independently and found your patent afterward, the connection is interesting but legally limited. But if she built the software using your patent as a foundational reference, even without understanding the legal implications of doing so, then the chain of intellectual property ownership runs from your patent through to her software, which means you have a legitimate claim as a co-originator of the intellectual property." She paused. She said, "And that changes everything about this case." I said I had thought it might. She picked up the drafting sheets again and looked at one of them for a long moment. She said the handwriting, the calculations, the filing date, everything was consistent with the timeline I had described. She said the patent itself was clearly valid. It had been approved by the patent office and had never been challenged or expired, because the maintenance fees had been paid. I told her I had paid them every 4 years without fail. Not because I expected anything to come of it, just because it seemed wrong to let it lapse. She looked at me over her glasses for a moment, with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. She said, "Mr. Hutchins, that may be the most fortunate habit you have ever maintained." She set the sheets down and folded her hands on the desk. She said she wanted to examine Lily's source code before she made any formal assessment. She said she needed to see the actual technical architecture of the software to establish the connection in terms that would hold up to professional scrutiny. She said she could not make claims she had not personally verified, which was, she said, a principle she applied to everything. I told her about the password. I told her Lily's source code was protected and that Lily would not share the password with anyone she did not trust, under any circumstances. I told her that was not stubbornness, it was judgment, and so far, her judgment had been correct. Patricia considered that for a moment. Then she said, "Can you arrange for me to meet your granddaughter?" I said I thought I could. She said she would need perhaps an hour with Lily and the software. She said she would not ask for the password to be shared broadly. She understood the sensitivity, and she worked within appropriate boundaries. She said if Lily was willing to show her the relevant portions of the code in a controlled setting, that would be sufficient for her assessment. I said I would ask Lily. I gathered the patent and the drafting sheets back into the manila envelope. At the door, I stopped. I said, "Miss Owens, I want to ask you the same thing I asked Roy Simmons. Is what I have enough? She looked at me directly. She said, if the software is what you believe it is, and if your granddaughter is willing to cooperate in the way you are describing, then yes. What you have is not just enough. It is more than enough. It is the kind of thing that does not come along often in cases like this. She said, the people on the other side of this have money and legal sophistication, but they do not have the truth. And in my experience, the truth properly documented, properly presented, at the right moment, is worth considerably more than either of those things. I thanked her and took the elevator back down. On Michigan Avenue, the wind was coming off the lake, and the gray morning had not changed its mind about being gray. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with the manila envelope under my arm. I needed to talk to Lily, not around the edges of it. Not in the careful, oblique way I had been managing her awareness of the situation. I needed to sit down with her and tell her everything, and ask her directly what she was willing to do. Because what happened next depended on her. It had always depended on her. I just had not said it out loud yet. I drove home from Michigan Avenue, the long way again. Not because I needed to think this time. I had done my thinking. I drove the long way because I was in no hurry to arrive at a conversation I did not entirely know how to begin. In 30 years of managing bus routes and 8 years of raising Lily, I had learned that there were certain conversations you could not prepare for the way you prepared for other things. You could not outline them or rehearse them or decide in advance exactly how they were going to go. You just had to walk into the room and trust that the words would be there when you needed them. I parked on Millbrook Avenue and sat in the truck for a moment looking at the house. The blue light in Lily's window was steady. She had been at her desk since before I left that morning, which meant she had probably eaten nothing since the toast I had left on the counter before I went out. I would need to make something before we talked. You did not have difficult conversations with Lily when she was hungry. Hunger affected her concentration in ways that made the world harder to navigate. And the world was already going to be hard enough today. I went inside and made soup. The simple kind, from a can, with crackers on the side. The combination she had accepted without objection since she was 8 years old. I carried the tray upstairs and knocked twice on her door. She said, "Come in," without stopping her typing. I set the tray on the corner of her desk that she kept clear for exactly this purpose. She had designated it years ago as the place where food could be placed without disrupting her work, which I had always found both practical and quietly moving. I sat down on the edge of her bed and waited while she finished whatever she was working on. After a few minutes, the typing slowed and stopped. She pulled the tray toward her and began eating without looking at me, which was her way of signaling that she was available to talk but was not going to initiate it. That was fine. I had never needed her to initiate things. I just needed her to be willing to listen, which she always was. I told her I had met with the patent lawyer that morning. I told her the lawyer's name was Patricia Owens, and that she was careful and honest, and that Roy Simmons trusted her, which in my view was as strong a recommendation as I could offer. Lily ate her soup and listened. I told her what Patricia had explained about the intellectual property question, about the patent and the software, and the chain of ownership that potentially connected them. I used plain language because plain language was what Lily preferred. She had no patience for softened versions of things, for information wrapped in reassurance. She wanted the facts in the order they occurred, and she wanted them complete. I told her Patricia needed to see the source code. Lily set her spoon down. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the middle monitor, not at anything on it, just at a point in the middle distance that happened to be in that direction. This was how she processed things that required careful consideration. She went still and looked at nothing and thought, and I had learned over 8 years not to interrupt that process. Then she said, Why does she need to see the source code? I explained it the way Patricia had explained it to me. That the connection between the patent and the software had to be established not just in theory, but in verifiable technical terms. That Patricia could not make professional claims she had not personally confirmed. That the source code was the evidence, the actual record of how the software had been built and on what foundational principles. Lily considered that. She said, if she sees the source code, she will understand how it works. I said yes. She said, and if she understands how it works, she can explain it to the court. I said that was the idea. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, and the other side, Trent, he has been trying to get the password so he can see the source code himself. I said that was correct. That was what the asset freeze was partially about, establishing legal grounds to compel access to the software's underlying architecture. Lily picked up her spoon again and finished the last of her soup in the careful, methodical way she finished everything. She aligned the spoon with the edge of the bowl when she was done. She moved the tray to the corner of the desk. Then she turned her chair to face me directly. This did not happen often. When Lily turned her chair all the way around, it meant she had finished processing and had arrived at a conclusion and wanted to communicate it without any ambiguity. I sat up slightly on the edge of the bed. She said, I will show Patricia Owens the source code, but I will show her on my computer, in this room, with you present, and I will not give her the password. I will enter it myself, and I will control what she sees and for how long. I said that sounded reasonable to me, and that I believed Patricia would accept those terms. Lily nodded. Then she said something that I had not expected. She said, Grandpa, I knew about the patent before I started writing the software. I looked at her. She said it without particular emphasis. The way she stated all facts directly, without performance, as though the information existed independently of any emotion attached to it, and she was simply reporting its existence. I said, I know, Lily. I had worked that out. She said, I found it in the drawer when I was looking for a pencil. I read it because it was a technical document, and technical documents are worth reading. And the principle it described was interesting to me, so I kept thinking about it, and eventually I started building something based on it. She paused. She said, I did not tell you because I did not think it would matter. I thought it was just an old piece of paper that no one was using anymore. I said, it was an old piece of paper that no one was using anymore. Until now. She looked at me for a moment, with that particular expression of hers, the one that was not quite a smile, but contained the same quality. The recognition of something fitting together correctly. She said, did you always know it would be important someday? I thought about that honestly. The way she deserved to have her questions thought about. I said, no. I kept it because it seemed wrong to throw away something I had worked that hard on. I paid the fees because it seemed wrong to let it expire. But I did not know it was going to matter. I just knew it was mine and that it was true, and that those two things were worth preserving even when they did not seem useful. She absorbed that in the way she absorbed things completely and without visible reaction, storing it somewhere internal where she would process it further at her own pace. Then she turned back to her monitors. She said, tell Patricia Owens she can come Thursday afternoon, after 3 o'clock, not before. I said I would. I picked up the tray and stood up from the bed. At the door, I stopped and looked back at her. She was already typing again, the blue light of the monitors steady around her, the room quiet except for the sound of her keyboard. I had walked into that room not knowing how to begin. I walked out of it knowing that the most important conversation in our case had just taken place not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but here, in a room that smelled like warm electronics and unscented soap. between a 75-year-old man and a 15-year-old girl who had understood the situation more completely than anyone had given her credit for. She always had. That was the thing about Lily that Trent Caldwell had never considered and could not have anticipated. He had looked at the case and seen a minor, a child, a ward to be controlled, and an asset to be managed. He had not looked closely enough to see what I had spent 8 years learning to see, that she was the most precise thinker in any room she entered, and she had been 3 steps ahead of all of us from the beginning. Patricia Owens arrived on Thursday at 3 o'clock exactly. I had expected nothing less. She was the kind of person for whom punctuality was not a courtesy, but a standard, the baseline from which everything else was measured. She came to the door in a coat the color of charcoal, carrying a leather bag and the same quality of focused attention she had brought to her office on Michigan Avenue. I took her coat and offered her coffee, which she accepted, and then I led her upstairs. I knocked twice on Lily's door. Lily said, "Come in." The room was as it always was. The 3 monitors, the blue light, the particular order that was entirely Lily's own. Lily was sitting at her desk with her hands in her lap, which meant she had stopped working before we arrived and had been waiting. That level of preparation was unusual for her. It told me she had been thinking about this meeting since Tuesday and had decided how she wanted it to go. I introduced them simply. "Lily, this is Patricia Owens. Patricia, this is my granddaughter Lily." Patricia said it was good to meet her, and meant it in the straightforward way that Lily could always detect. She had an unerring ability to distinguish genuine regard from performed regard, and performed regard made her close down immediately. Patricia's directness passed whatever internal assessment Lily applied to new people. Lily said, "You want to see the source code?" Patricia said, "Yes. If you are willing to show me." Lily turned to her monitors. She said, "I am going to show you the core architecture, the filtration algorithm, and the signal processing layer. Those are the parts that came from the patent. The rest is mine independently, and I would prefer you not examine it today." Patricia said,
That is entirely reasonable.
I watched from the edge of the bed as Lily entered her password, her body positioned so that neither Patricia nor I could see the keystrokes, a precaution she had clearly planned in advance. The center monitor came to life with lines of code that meant nothing to me, but that Patricia leaned toward with immediate and focused interest. For the next 40 minutes, Lily walked Patricia through the relevant sections of the software. I cannot describe the technical content of what was shown because I understood very little of it. What I can describe is the quality of the exchange between them, and it was unlike anything I had expected. Lily spoke in her precise technical language, and Patricia responded in kind, asking questions that were specific and informed, and Lily answered them fully and without hesitation. There was a fluency between them, a shared vocabulary, that I had never witnessed Lily use with anyone outside of her own internal world. At one point, Patricia asked Lily to walk her through a specific section of the algorithm. The part that Patricia said was, in her words, the heart of the noise filtration logic. Lily did so without looking at Patricia, her eyes on the screen, her voice carrying the particular quality it had when she was explaining something she understood completely and expected to be understood completely in return. Patricia said nothing for a moment after that explanation. Then she said, "Lily, how old were you when you wrote this section?" Lily said, 13. Patricia was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "And you developed this approach by reading a hardware patent filed in 1998. Lily said, "I developed it by thinking about the principle the patent described and working out what that principle would look like in software. The patent describes a hardware solution. I built a software solution to the same problem, using the same underlying logic. They are not the same thing. But one came from the other." Patricia said, "Yes, That is exactly what I needed to hear you say. She straightened up from the screen and made a note in the small notebook she had taken from her bag. She wrote for about 30 seconds, then capped her pen and looked at Lily directly. She said, "Lily, I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I am saying it as a professional assessment, not as a compliment. What you have built here is extraordinary. The elegance of the approach, the efficiency of the code, the way you translated a hardware principle into a software architecture. These are not things that most trained engineers with years of experience would think to do, let alone execute at this level." Lily looked at the monitor. She said, "I know." She said it without arrogance and without false modesty. She said it the way she said everything that was simply true. Patricia almost smiled. I saw it at the edge of her expression. The same thing I had seen at the edge of Roy's expression when I had told him about the patent. The recognition that something was exactly what it needed to be. We went downstairs after that. Lily stayed in her room. Patricia and I sat at the kitchen table with our coffee, and Patricia opened her notebook and looked at her notes for a moment before she spoke. She said, "Mr. Hutchins, I can now tell you with professional confidence what I could only tell you in theory on Tuesday. The core algorithmic architecture of your granddaughter's software derives directly and demonstrably from the technical principles described in your 1998 patent. The connection is not ambiguous, and it is not arguable. It is clear enough that I can document it in terms that will withstand examination by any qualified expert the other side might bring in." She said, "Which means the intellectual property chain runs from your patent through to her software. You are a co-originator of the asset. And that means Trent Caldwell's entire legal strategy is built on a foundation that does not exist. He assumed he needed one thing, guardianship of a minor, to control an asset worth $1 million. What he actually needs is your cooperation. And your cooperation is not something a court can compel in this situation, because your patent rights predate the asset itself." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "So without me, he has nothing." She said, "Without you, he has a guardianship case that controls a minor, but not the underlying intellectual property that gives the asset its value. ClearPath Technologies will not complete the acquisition without clear title to the full intellectual property chain. And clear title requires your signature, as well as Lily's." I said, "And he does not know that." She said, "He does not know that yet. His filing makes no reference to your patent because he has no reason to believe your patent is relevant. He does not know it exists in connection to this software. He walked into this case with incomplete information, and he has been building his entire strategy on that incomplete foundation." I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The garden was bare and brown in the November cold, the last of the season's effort long spent. My wife's empty flower boxes on the windowsill. The particular stillness of a yard that was waiting for something for spring, for warmth, for whatever came next. I thought about a man in a charcoal overcoat standing on my porch with a leather briefcase, certain that he had already won. I asked Patricia what she needed from me to move forward. She said she needed to prepare a formal intellectual property assessment, a document that established in precise professional terms the connection between the patent and the software, the chain of ownership, and the implications for the pending acquisition. She said she could have it ready within a week. She said she also needed to coordinate with Roy on the timing of when and how this information was introduced into the legal proceedings. She said the moment of disclosure mattered as much as the disclosure itself. Introduced too early, it gave Trent time to construct a counterargument. Introduced at the right moment, it collapsed his case before he had time to respond. I said Roy had used the word meticulous. She said Roy was correct. She closed her notebook and put it in her bag and stood up. At the door, she stopped and looked at me with the direct regard that was her particular quality. She said, "Mr. Hutchins, I have handled intellectual property cases for 22 years. I have worked with inventors and artists and engineers and programmers. I have never encountered a situation quite like this one. A grandfather and a granddaughter who built something together without knowing they were building it together, and whose work only became visible when someone tried to take it from them." She said, "I think that is worth protecting." I said, "Yes, it is." She left, and I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Upstairs, the keyboard had started again. The sound of it filled the house the way it always did. Steady, purposeful. The particular rhythm of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and is doing it without hesitation. I stood there and listened to it for a long moment. Then I went to the kitchen and called Roy Simmons. It was time to set the trap. Roy came to the house on Saturday morning. He arrived at 8 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Halstead Street that he trusted above all others in a 3-mile radius, and a folder under his arm that was thicker than the one he had shown me in his office. He set the coffee on the kitchen table and sat down and opened the folder, and we got to work. Lily was upstairs. I had told her Roy was coming, and she had said she would stay in her room unless she was needed, which was her way of saying she trusted us to handle the parts that did not require her, and would be available for the parts that did. Roy laid out what he had. In the 2 weeks since our meeting on South Wabash Avenue, he had been building a picture of Trent Caldwell's operation with the methodical patience that was his greatest professional strength. He had contacts in places that contacts were useful. Former colleagues from his years on the CTA, people who had moved into various corners of the city's legal and financial world. A retired federal investigator named Marsh, who owed Roy a favor of long standing, and had access to certain databases that were not publicly available. What they had assembled was detailed. Trent's connection to Victor Caruso was documented through 3 years of financial records. Not the records themselves, which Roy could not legally obtain, but the pattern of transactions that showed up in the public record, if you knew where to look, and how to read what you found. Shell companies in Delaware and Nevada, real estate transactions that did not track with market values, a series of legal fees paid to Caldwell and Associates by entities that had no visible business operations. The debt was real, and it was current. Roy's most recent information put the figure at $840,000. Caruso had added penalties twice in the past 6 months. Danny Farrow had been seen outside Trent's office building a 3rd time, the previous Wednesday. Trent was out of runway, Roy said. The man is desperate, and desperate men make one of 2 choices. They either do something reckless, or they do something that looks reckless from the outside, but is actually a calculated final move. I believe Trent is going to make his final move at the preliminary hearing next week. He is going to push for an immediate transfer of temporary guardianship pending full resolution, which would give him and Sandra legal authority over Lily's financial decisions right now, without waiting for the full case to be decided. I asked if the court would grant that. Roy said it was possible. Temporary orders in family cases were easier to obtain than permanent ones. The bar was lower. A judge looking at the surface of the situation. Elderly grandfather, fixed income, child with special needs, biological mother with a stable household and a lawyer husband, might well grant a temporary order as a precautionary measure while the full case proceeded. I said, and if he gets a temporary order, he can move on the software sale immediately. Roy said, he can attempt to, but here is where your position is stronger than he knows. Patricia's assessment establishes that the intellectual property chain runs through your patent. ClearPath Technologies cannot complete a clean acquisition without your signature on the transfer documents. Even if Trent gets temporary guardianship of Lily, he cannot force you to sign anything. And without your signature, the deal cannot close, I said. So he would have Lily and still not have the money. Roy said, correct. And with Caruso's people watching his building, he does not have the time to wait for a full guardianship ruling, which could take 6 months or more. He paused. He said, which is why the timing of Patricia's disclosure is everything. If we introduce the patent evidence at the preliminary hearing next week, Trent will know immediately that his strategy has failed. He will have no time to construct an alternative approach. His case collapses in the courtroom. And then his other problem, Caruso, becomes his only problem. Without the prospect of the software money, he has nothing to offer Caruso. And Caruso, in my experience, does not respond well to nothing, I said. So we let him walk into the preliminary hearing, thinking he is about to win, Roy said. We let him walk in, thinking exactly that. We file responses to his motions that are thorough and time-consuming, but that reveal nothing about the patent. We give him no indication that we have anything beyond a routine defense. We let him prepare his arguments based on what he knows, which is incomplete. And then, at the right moment in the hearing, Patricia presents her assessment and the patent documentation. And the foundation he has been building on turns out not to be there. He closed the folder. He said, there is one more thing we need. He said the financial records and the documented connection to Caruso, the evidence he had assembled about Trent's criminal entanglements, needed to be in the hands of the right people before the hearing, not after. He had already been in contact with an assistant state's attorney named Warren, whom he described as careful and motivated, and not the kind of person who needed to be convinced twice when the evidence was solid. He said Warren had reviewed what Roy had provided and was prepared to move. Not before the hearing, the timing had to be precise. But simultaneously, while Patricia was presenting the intellectual property assessment to the family court, Warren's office would be executing a search warrant on Caldwell and Associates. I looked at Roy across the kitchen table. I said, you have been busy, he said. I have been thorough. There is a difference. He picked up his coffee and drank the last of it. He said, Earl, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it carefully before you answer. When this is over, when the hearing is done and the patent evidence is presented, and Warren's people have done what they are going to do, Sandra is going to lose. Not just this case. Everything. Whatever assets she and Trent have built together are going to be subject to criminal proceedings. Her husband is going to prison. Her life as she has constructed it is going to be finished. He said, she is Lily's mother. However she has behaved, that is a biological fact. I want to make sure you have thought about what that means for Lily, and whether there is anything about this plan you want to reconsider. I sat with that for a moment. I gave it the honest consideration it deserved. I thought about the 7-year-old girl on my porch with a pink duffel bag. About 8 years of mornings and hardwood floors and soup on a tray and bananas sliced thin. About what Sandra had walked away from and what she had walked back toward, and why. I thought about Lily upstairs at her desk. About the way she had turned her chair to face me and said, I will show Patricia Owens the source code. And the calm precision of someone who had already decided who she trusted and who she did not. I said, Roy, Sandra made her choices. She made them 8 years ago when she left, and she made them again 3 weeks ago when she came back. I cannot protect her from the consequences of her own choices. That is not something I have the right to do. He nodded. I said, what I can do is make sure that when this is over, Lily is in a position where nobody can come back and try this again. The trust in Delaware, Patricia mentioned it. I want to understand how that works. Roy said Patricia had already drawn up the structure. A trust established in Delaware with Lily as the sole beneficiary. The proceeds from the software sale deposited directly into the trust at closing, administered by Patricia as trustee until Lily turned 21. No access, no control. No legal avenue available to Sandra or Trent or anyone else. He said, "The money goes in, and it stays there until Lily is old enough to decide what to do with it herself." I said, "That is what I want." Roy gathered his folder and stood up. He said the preliminary hearing was Thursday. He said I should wear the suit I wore to formal occasions. Not to impress anyone. Just because a man who is about to win something important should look like he understands the weight of the occasion. I said I had a suit. I had not worn it since my wife's funeral, but I had it. Roy said that would do. I walked him to the door. On the porch, he stopped and turned back. He said, "Earl, you know what the difference is between you and Trent Caldwell?" I said I had some ideas, but I would hear his. He said, "He has been playing chess. Moving pieces, calculating exchanges, trying to put you in a position where you have no good moves left. He is very good at it. He has been doing it his whole career." He said, "But you have not been playing chess." I said, "What have I been playing?" Roy looked at me for a moment. He said, "You have been raising Lily. And it turns out, those are not the same game at all." He went down the porch steps and got in his car and drove away. I stood on the porch in the November cold for a moment, watching the street. Thursday. 4 days. I went back inside and put the kettle on and listened to the keyboard overhead and let the house settle around me the way it always did when everything that needed to be said had been said, and all that remained was the waiting. The 4 days before the hearing moved the way time moves when you are waiting for something you cannot hurry. Monday, I went through the house and made sure everything was in order. Not for any practical reason, just because I needed to do something with my hands. I fixed a loose hinge on the back door that I had been meaning to fix for 2 months. I cleaned the gutters, which was probably the last time I would be doing that from a ladder at my age. But the gutters needed doing, and I needed the work. I reorganized the top drawer of the oak desk so that the patent and the drafting sheets were at the front. The manila envelope, clean and flat and ready. Tuesday, I drove to the dry cleaner on 63rd Street and picked up the suit. It was a dark navy, the one I had bought for my wife's funeral 7 years ago and had not worn since. The dry cleaner had pressed it without being asked. I hung it on the back of the bedroom door and looked at it for a moment. My wife had always said navy was the right color for serious occasions. She had opinions about things like that, firm, well-reasoned opinions that turned out to be correct often enough that I had learned to defer to them, even when she was no longer there to offer them. Wednesday morning, Roy called to confirm the timing. He said Patricia would be in the courtroom with her formal assessment document and the patent materials. He said Warren's office had confirmed the search warrant was ready and would be executed simultaneously with the hearing, not before, not after, but during, so that Trent's phone would begin receiving calls he could not answer at exactly the moment he needed to be focused on what was happening in front of the judge. Roy said the timing was not accidental. He said a man receiving bad news from 2 directions at once has difficulty managing either one effectively. I said it sounded like something you would do. To a bus route that was running late, hit the problem from both ends simultaneously, so it had nowhere to go. Roy said that was a reasonable analogy. He asked how Lily was. I said she was working, which was her answer to most things that the world put in front of her. She worked. She built. She created order in the form of code, while everything outside her room attempted disorder. I had come to find it genuinely reassuring. As long as the keyboard was running overhead, things were not as bad as they could be. Roy said to get some sleep. I said I would try. I did not entirely succeed. I lay in the dark Wednesday night and listened to the house and thought about things in the particular way you think about things at 3 in the morning without the discipline that daylight imposes, following one thought to the next without any particular destination. I thought about my wife and what she would have made of all this. She had been a practical woman with a sharp sense of justice and a deep impatience with people who used the machinery of respectability to do disrespectable things. She would have had opinions about Trent Caldwell. She would have had opinions about Sandra. She would have had strong and specific opinions about both, delivered in the dry, measured way she delivered all her strong opinions. And she would have been right about all of them. I thought about what Roy had said on the porch, that I had not been playing chess, that I had been raising Lily, and those were not the same game. I thought about that for a long time in the dark, because the truth was, I had not been strategic about any of it. I had not kept the patent because I foresaw this moment. I had not bought Lily the computers, or sat on the hardwood floor, or listened to the Sunday breakfast explanations because I was building a case. I had done those things because they were the right things to do, and because Lily needed them, and because she was mine to take care of, and I had taken care of her. The patent, the software, the intellectual property chain that was about to collapse Trent Caldwell's carefully constructed strategy. None of it had been planned. It had accumulated the way honest things accumulate when a person simply does what they are supposed to do, day after day, without calculation or agenda. That was the thing Trent had not been able to account for. He had built his plan on the assumption that I was playing the same game he was, that I had resources I was concealing, moves I was holding in reserve, a counter-strategy designed to mirror his own. He had not considered the possibility that I was not playing a game at all, that what he was up against was not strategy, but something simpler and harder to defeat. 8 years of showing up. I fell asleep somewhere after 4 and woke at 6 and made oatmeal. The keyboard was already running when I came downstairs. Of course it was. I made 2 bowls, sliced the banana thin, called up the stairs, heard the keyboard stop. She came down in her gray sweatshirt, same as always, sat in her chair by the window, pulled her bowl toward her. We ate in our silence. After a while, she said, "Is today important?" I said, "Tomorrow is. Today is just today." She ate another spoonful. She said, "Are you nervous?" I thought about that, honestly. I said, "I am 75 years old. I have buried my wife and managed 30 years of bus routes through Chicago winters and raised you for 8 years. There is not much left that makes me nervous in the way it used to." She considered that. She said, "But," I said, "but I want it to go well. I want it to go well for you. That is different from nervous. That is just caring about something." She looked at her bowl for a moment. Then she said, "It will go well." She said it the way she said everything she had already calculated, with the certainty of someone who had run the numbers and trusted the result. I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you have been right about everything so far. You were right to keep the patent. You were right to call Roy. You were right about Patricia Owens. You have been right every time it mattered." She paused. She said, "I have been watching you be right about things my whole life. I do not have any reason to think tomorrow will be different." I looked at my granddaughter across the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in November, in the thin autumn light coming through the window, with her oatmeal and her gray sweatshirt, and her 15-year-old certainty that was not the false certainty of someone who had not considered the alternatives, but the genuine certainty of someone who had considered all of them and still arrived at the same answer. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Finish your breakfast. You have work to do." She turned back to her bowl, and I sat across from her and drank my coffee, and felt something settle in my chest that I did not have a precise name for. Not confidence exactly, not peace exactly. Something between the two. The feeling of a man who has done everything he could do with what he had, and who is now ready to let the truth do the rest. Tomorrow was the hearing. Tonight, I would sleep. And in the morning, I would put on the navy suit my wife had always said was right for serious occasions. And I would walk into that courtroom, and I would let 8 years of showing up speak for itself. The morning of the hearing, I was up at 5. Not because I had set an alarm. I had not needed an alarm since my working years, when the body learns to wake itself at the required hour and never entirely forgets. I lay in the dark for a few minutes listening to the house, and then I got up and went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at Millbrook Avenue in the last of the night. The street was empty and still. The sodium lights made everything look amber and remote. The way the world looks at 5 in the morning when it has not yet decided to be the day. A light snow had fallen overnight, not enough to cover anything properly, just enough to soften the edges of things, to lay a thin white film over the garden and the sidewalk and the roofs of the cars parked along the curb. I drank my coffee and thought about nothing in particular. That was deliberate. I had learned over a long life that the morning of something important was not the time for additional thinking. The thinking had been done. The preparation had been done. What remained was simply to show up and be present and trust the work that had already been completed. A dispatcher who second-guesses his routes on the morning of a difficult day does not help those routes run. He just makes himself less useful. At 6, I went upstairs and got dressed. The navy suit fit the way it had always fit well enough, which was all I had ever asked of clothes. My wife had bought it for me at a shop on Michigan Avenue, the same street where Patricia Owens had her office, which seemed like the kind of coincidence that was not really a coincidence but just the city being the city. I put on the white shirt and the dark tie and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. A 75-year-old man in a good suit. That was what I had to work with. I decided it was enough. Lily was already at her desk when I knocked at 6:30. I told her I was leaving and that Roy would call when it was over. She turned her chair partway toward me, not all the way, just enough to see me clearly, and looked at the suit for a moment. She said, "You look like Grandpa when something matters." I said, "It matters." She turned back to her monitors. I drove to the Cook County Family Court building on West Washington Street and parked in the garage and sat in the truck for a moment. The building was the kind of building that courthouses tend to be: substantial, deliberate, designed to communicate the weight of what happens inside it. I had been in courthouses before, for the routine legal matters of a property dispute years ago, jury duty twice, my wife's estate. But I had not been in one for something like this. I went inside and found the courtroom and sat in the gallery to wait. Patricia Owens arrived 12 minutes later, carrying her leather bag and the calm authority that was simply how she moved through the world. She sat beside me and said good morning, and asked if I had slept. I said adequately. She said that was probably better than Trent had managed, which I thought was likely true. Trent and Sandra arrived with their legal team at 8:52 associates from his firm, plus a paralegal carrying a rolling cart of documents. Trent was in a charcoal suit that matched the overcoat he had worn to my porch. He moved with the confidence of a man who had done this many times and expected to do it again. Sandra was beside him in a dark dress, her face arranged into the expression of a concerned mother, which I recognized as performance because I had seen the real thing and it did not look like that. Trent glanced at me across the courtroom. I looked back at him without expression. He looked away first. The judge was a woman named Honorable Catherine Marsh. No relation to Roy's contact. Just the particular coincidence of surnames in a city this size. She was in her early 60s, efficient, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the manner of someone who had heard a great many stories in this room and had developed a precise instrument for distinguishing the ones that were true from the ones that were constructed. The hearing began. Trent's lead associate presented their case first. It was, as Roy had predicted, polished and thorough. The argument was built on the surface facts: my age, my income, my lack of formal credentials in special needs care, the instability of a fixed pension as a financial foundation for a child whose needs were complex and whose assets were now significant. They presented a psychological assessment of Lily that had been conducted without my knowledge or consent, which Patricia leaned over and quietly told me was procedurally questionable and would be challenged. They presented financial projections showing the responsible management of Lily's software asset under proper legal guardianship. They presented Sandra as a rehabilitated mother, a stable presence, a woman who had made mistakes and grown from them. They presented Trent as a legal professional uniquely positioned to manage the complexity of the intellectual property transaction in Lily's best interest. It was a good presentation. It was built entirely on what they knew, and what they knew was not everything. I sat in the gallery in my navy suit, and I listened to all of it, and I kept my face still, and I waited. Patricia had told me she would present when the judge opened the floor to the respondent's case. She had the patent documentation and her formal assessment in the leather bag beside her. Roy was in the back of the gallery. I had not looked for him, but I knew he was there. Warren's people were in position outside the building on West Washington Street. Everything was in place. The judge finished her questions to Trent's team and made a note and looked up. She said, "Does the respondent wish to present?" Patricia Owens stood up. She said, "Yes, Your Honor. The respondent does." And across the courtroom, Trent Caldwell's phone began to vibrate in his breast pocket. Patricia spoke for 34 minutes. I know the exact duration because there was a clock on the wall of the courtroom directly in my line of sight. And I watched it the way you watch something when you need your eyes to be somewhere that is not the face of the man whose world is being taken apart in front of you. She began with the patent. She laid it out in the methodical way that was her professional signature: the filing date, the inventor, the technical description, the approval by the Patent Office in the spring of 1999. She submitted the original document as evidence and the drafting sheets alongside it. She described, in terms that were precise without being impenetrable, what the patent protected and why it was valid and current. Then she described Lily's software. She described the core algorithmic architecture, the filtration logic, the signal processing layer. She described the technical approach Lily had taken and the foundational principle on which that approach was built. She described, in professional terms, that she had spent a week preparing and that she delivered with the authority of someone who did not make claims she could not defend. The direct and demonstrable connection between the hardware principle in Earl Hutchins's 1998 patent and the software architecture created by Lily Hutchins beginning at age 12. She said, "The intellectual property chain in this case does not begin with the miner. It begins with the patent holder, and the patent holder is the respondent, Earl James Hutchins, who has maintained that patent in good standing for 26 years. She said, "The asset that the petitioners seek to control through guardianship of the miner, the software program valued at $1 million by ClearPath Technologies, cannot be transferred, sold, or licensed without the signature and cooperation of the patent holder. Guardianship of the miner does not convey that authority. It never did. The petitioner's entire legal strategy is premised on a misunderstanding of the intellectual property structure of the asset they are seeking to control. She set her notes down. She said, "Your Honor, the petitioners came into this courtroom today to argue that an elderly man on a fixed income is not capable of caring for his granddaughter. What they did not know, and what this court now knows, is that the same elderly man on a fixed income holds the patent that makes his granddaughter's work possible. He has held it for 26 years. He has maintained it faithfully, and without his cooperation, the asset at the center of this case is worth nothing to anyone." The courtroom was quiet. I looked at the clock. 32 minutes had passed. I allowed myself, for the first time, to look at Trent Caldwell. He was not looking at the judge. He was not looking at Patricia. He was looking at the document in front of him, the copy of the patent assessment that Patricia had submitted with the expression of a man who has just understood something that he cannot ununderstand and cannot undo. His phone had vibrated 3 times in his pocket during Patricia's presentation. He had not reached for it. He was a lawyer. He knew better than to reach for his phone in a courtroom. But he also knew, I suspected, exactly who was calling. The judge looked at the patent documentation for a long moment. She looked at Patricia's assessment. She asked 2 questions, technical questions, precisely formulated, and Patricia answered both of them fully and without hesitation. Then the judge looked at Trent's team. She asked if the petitioners wished to respond to the intellectual property assessment. Trent's lead associate stood up. He was a young man, well-trained, and he did the best he could with what he had, which was very little. He said the assessment required independent verification. He said the connection between the patent and the software was not established to the standard required for legal determination. He said the petitioners reserved the right to bring their own expert witness. The judge listened to all of this. Then she said, in the measured tone of someone who has already formed a view and is now simply completing the procedure, that the intellectual property question raised by the respondent's evidence was substantive and material to the case. She said she was not prepared to grant a temporary guardianship order in circumstances where the financial asset at the center of the petition was subject to a legitimate ownership dispute that had not been resolved. She said the petition for temporary guardianship was denied pending full evidentiary hearing. She said the case would be rescheduled for a full hearing with appropriate time for both sides to present expert testimony on the intellectual property question. She said the existing asset freeze was lifted, as it had been predicated on the assumption that guardianship of the minor was sufficient to control the asset, an assumption that the respondent's evidence had placed in serious doubt. She thanked both parties and adjourned. The gavel came down. Patricia turned to me and said, in a voice that was professional and calm and contained within it something that was not quite triumph but was in that direction, that the temporary denial was the best possible outcome. She said the full hearing would be scheduled, but that she did not expect it to proceed, for reasons that would become clear in the coming days. I said I understood. I looked across the courtroom. Trent had his phone out now. He was looking at the screen with the expression of a man reading something that he already knew was going to be on the screen, but had been hoping, in the way that people hope for things they know are not going to happen, that it would not be there. Sandra was beside him with her hand on his arm, asking him something I could not hear. He did not answer her. Roy appeared at my shoulder. He said quietly, Warren's people are in the building. They executed the warrant at 9:17, which was approximately 14 minutes into Patricia's presentation. He said Caldwell and Associates was currently being searched. He said Trent's partners had been notified. He said the next 48 hours were going to be significant. I nodded. I picked up my coat from the gallery seat and put it on. At the door of the courtroom, I stopped and turned back one last time. Trent Caldwell was still sitting at the petitioner's table with his phone in his hand, and his careful confidence entirely gone, replaced by something I recognized from 30 years of watching people encounter the consequences of choices they had made. The particular stillness of a man who has just run out of moves. Sandra was talking to him, and he was not hearing her. I turned and walked out of the courtroom and down the corridor and out through the main doors of the Cook County Family Court building onto West Washington Street, where the thin November snow had melted in the morning sun, and the sidewalk was wet and ordinary, and the city was going about its business the way it always did, indifferent to what had just happened inside. Roy came out behind me. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I said, "Is it over?" He said, "The courtroom part is over. The rest of it will take some time. But yes, Earl, for you and Lily, it is over." I looked up at the sky over West Washington Street. It was the particular blue that Chicago sometimes produces in November between one gray day and the next, clear and cold and very high. The kind of blue that makes the city look like it was designed by someone who understood proportion. I said, "I need to call Lily." Roy said, "Yes, you do." I took out my phone and dialed the house. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. I said, "It's done. Lily." There was a pause. Then she said, "I know." And somehow, with Lily, that was always enough. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before. Before the hearing, time had been compressed every day, carrying the weight of what was coming. Every morning, beginning with the awareness that the situation was unresolved, and that unresolved things have a way of demanding your attention, even when you have done everything you can do about them. After the hearing, time expanded again. The days became days rather than countdowns. The house became a house again rather than a position being defended. Lily noticed the change before I did. 2 days after the hearing, she came down to breakfast and sat in her chair and ate her oatmeal and then said, without looking up, that the house felt different. I asked her what she meant. She said it felt the way it used to feel before. I said I knew what she meant. She nodded and went back upstairs, and the keyboard started, and that was the whole conversation, which was exactly the right length. Patricia called on the Monday following the hearing. She said Trent's legal team had filed a motion to withdraw from the case. She said this was not surprising. The attorneys representing him in the family court matter were from his own firm, and with Caldwell and Associates under active criminal investigation. The firm's partners had considerably more pressing concerns than a custody case in the Cook County Family Division. She said the withdrawal of counsel effectively suspended the petitioner's case indefinitely. She said she expected the case to be formally dismissed within 30 days. I asked about the criminal investigation. She said Warren's office had found what it needed in the search of Caldwell and Associates: financial records, communications, documentation of the transactions that Roy's contacts had identified from the outside. She said the case against Trent was, in her assessment, substantial. She said she expected formal charges within the month. She said there was one other thing. She said Victor Caruso's organization had become aware, through channels she did not specify, that Trent's plan had failed and that the asset he had been promising to deliver was not going to be delivered. She said her understanding was that Caruso had responded to this information in the manner that was consistent with his character and his business practices. I asked what that meant specifically. She said she had heard, through Roy, that Trent had been approached by 2 men outside his home on the North Shore on the Saturday following the hearing. She said she did not know the details of what had been communicated. She said she suspected Trent's decision to cooperate fully with Warren's investigation, which had been reported to her as notably comprehensive and immediate, was not unrelated to that encounter. I said I understood. She said the Delaware Trust was ready to be executed. She said the Clear Path Technologies acquisition could now proceed once the trust documentation was in place, and both signatures, mine and Lily's, were obtained. She said Gerald Park had been in contact and was prepared to move quickly. I said, "Let us move quickly then." We signed the trust documents the following Wednesday, Lily and I, at Patricia's office on Michigan Avenue, with the lake gray and still through the window. Lily signed her name in the careful, precise hand she used for everything that required a pen rather than a keyboard. I signed mine beside it. Patricia witnessed both signatures and notarized the documents and said the trust was established and the acquisition could close. It closed 11 days later. $1 million transferred into the Delaware Trust, administered by Patricia Owens, accessible to Lily when she turned 21. Not to me, not to Sandra, not to Trent, not to anyone who had come to my door with a leather briefcase and an envelope, and the confidence of someone who had already decided how the story ended. I did not feel wealthy. I want to be clear about that. The money was Lily's, and it was in a trust, and it was going to stay there until she was old enough to decide what to do with it. And in the meantime, my life was exactly what it had been before Gerald Park had called on my landline a pension and a paid-off house and a garden I tended badly but consistently. What I felt was something different from wealthy, something quieter and more durable. I felt finished, in the good sense of that word, the sense of something that has been completed, that has reached the end it was always moving toward, that can now rest. Trent Caldwell was formally charged 6 weeks after the hearing. The charges included fraud upon the court, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. His assets were frozen by court order as part of the criminal proceedings. The North Shore house went into receivership. The firm dissolved. He was convicted the following autumn, 15 years. I heard about it from Roy, who called on a Thursday afternoon while I was in the backyard attempting, with limited success, to prepare the garden for winter. He said it simply and without ceremony, which was how Roy always delivered information that he considered to be the natural and inevitable conclusion of events that had been set in motion long before. I said thank you and hung up and stood in the backyard for a moment. I did not feel satisfaction. Exactly. I want to be honest about that. The outcome was just and it was right, and Trent had arrived at it through the accumulation of his own choices. The same way that all of us arrive at where we end up through the accumulation of ours. But there was nothing in me that wanted to celebrate it. It was simply the truth completing itself, the way the truth does when it is given enough time and the right circumstances. What I thought about, standing in the backyard with the November cold coming in and the garden waiting for winter, was Sandra. She had lost everything. The house, the life she and Trent had built, the money she had come to my door expecting to claim. She had contacted me once, about 3 months after the hearing, through a mutual acquaintance, not directly, because I think she understood by then that direct contact was not something I was prepared to offer. The message was that she was sorry, that she had made mistakes, that she hoped Lily was well. I did not respond, not out of cruelty, out of the understanding that some apologies arrive too late and in the wrong currency to purchase what the person offering them is hoping to purchase. Sandra's sorry could not buy back 8 years. It could not buy back the Tuesday she had stood on my porch with Trent behind her, watching me hold an envelope that was designed to take Lily away from the only home she had known. It could not buy back what she had been willing to do to her own daughter for the sake of a man who had been using her as an instrument of his own survival. I wished her no harm, but I also understood that wishing someone no harm and maintaining a relationship with them were two different things, and that I did not owe her the second one. Lily never asked about her, or rather, Lily asked once, about a month after the hearing. In the careful, precise way, she asked things she had been thinking about for a long time. She asked if Sandra would try again someday. I said I did not think so. She considered that. Then she said, "Good," and she went back to her keyboard, and that was the last time either of us spoke Sandra's name in that house. The years after that were good years. I want to say that plainly, without qualification or apology, because I think there is a tendency when telling a story like this one to focus so much on the difficulty that the good parts get compressed into a single sentence at the end, as though contentment is less interesting than conflict, and therefore deserves less space. But those years deserve their space. They were the point of everything that had come before them. Lily turned 16 in the spring following the hearing, which she marked in her characteristic way by not marking it at all, except to accept the particular meal I made that she had requested: roast chicken, mashed potatoes with no lumps, green beans cooked until they were soft rather than crisp. She had specific requirements about green beans that I had spent 2 years learning to meet consistently. I met them that evening, and she ate everything on her plate, which was her form of celebration. The software sale had given her something beyond money in the Delaware Trust. It had given her a credential, a real one, verifiable, documented by a technology company that had paid $1 million for her work. When she enrolled at the Illinois Institute of Technology 2 years later, studying computer science, that credential was part of her application, and it meant what credentials mean when they are genuine rather than performed. She was 17 when she left for college. I drove her there on a Sunday morning in late August. Her things in the back of the truck not much, because Lily did not accumulate things. She accumulated knowledge and skills and the particular internal architecture of a mind that had been building itself for 17 years. 2 boxes of books, a duffel bag of clothes, her laptop and her external drives in a case she carried on her lap the entire drive, because she did not trust the boxes in the truck bed with the equipment she actually needed. I carried the boxes up to her dormitory room and helped her set up her desk the way she needed it, monitors positioned at the exact angles she required, cables organized according to a system that made sense to her and that I had learned not to question. When we were done, I stood in the doorway and looked at the room and thought that it looked like her. Spare, ordered, purposeful. She walked me back to the truck. On the sidewalk outside the dormitory, she stopped and looked at me in the direct way she had, the way that told me she had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. She said, "Grandpa, I know what you did." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean all of it. 8 years of all of it. I know what it cost you, and I know you never said so, and I know you would not want me to say this, but I am going to say it anyway because it is true, and true things should be said." She paused. She said, "You are the reason I am okay. Not just okay. You are the reason I am this. Whatever this is." I looked at my granddaughter on a sidewalk in late August, 17 years old, standing in front of a university dormitory with her whole life in front of her, and I felt something move through me that I did not try to name, because some things are larger than the words available for them. I said, "You would have been fine regardless." She said, "No, I would not have. And you know that." I said, "Maybe." She said, "Not maybe. We stood there for a moment in the August morning, the campus moving around us. Other families doing the same thing we were doing, the particular choreography of leaving and being left that happens at the beginning of every school year, everywhere. Then she reached out and put her hand on my arm. She did not do this often. Physical contact was still something she managed carefully, something she offered only when she meant it precisely and completely. When she put her hand on my arm that morning, it was not a casual gesture. It was a specific and deliberate communication that meant exactly what it meant and nothing less. I put my hand over hers for a moment. Then she took her hand back and said she needed to go set up her computer properly because the angles I had helped her with were close but not quite right. And she turned and walked back into the dormitory and did not look back. Because Lily had never been a person who looked back. I stood by the truck for a moment. Then I drove home to Millbrook Avenue and the house that was just mine again for the first time in 10 years. And I made oatmeal 1 bowl, not 2. And I sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence of a house that has had someone in it for a long time and is now adjusting to having 1 fewer. And I let myself feel all of it. The pride and the loss and the satisfaction and the particular grief that is not grief exactly, but is what happens when something you have given your best years to is finished, successfully, and you are left with the quiet that comes after. It was the right kind of quiet, the kind that means something has been completed rather than abandoned. I called Roy that evening. He asked how the drop-off had gone. I said it had gone well. He asked if I was all right. I said I was better than all right. He said good and meant it. And we talked for a while about nothing in particular, the way old friends do when the important things have already been said, and what remains is just the comfort of the connection. After I hung up, I sat on the porch in the August evening and watched the street and thought about what came next. Not with anxiety, not with the pressing awareness of something unresolved, just with the open curiosity of a man who has finished 1 chapter and is turning the page. Whatever came next, I had time for it. And for the first time in a long time, time felt like a gift rather than a constraint. Lily met Marcus Webb in her 2nd year at Illinois Tech. She told me about him the way she told me about most things that mattered, not immediately, not with the breathless urgency that some people bring to new information, but after she had observed the situation long enough to be certain of what she was observing. She called me on a Sunday morning in February, which was our established call time since she had gone to college, and after the routine exchange of information about her coursework and my week, she said, almost as a continuation of the same sentence, that there was a person in her advanced algorithms class who she found she did not mind being around. For Lily, that was a significant statement. I asked what his name was. She said Marcus. She said he was a 3rd-year student studying electrical engineering. She said he was quiet and did not ask her unnecessary questions and did not seem to require her to perform social behaviors that she found effortful. She said he had explained something to her once about a circuit design problem she had been working through, and he had explained it correctly and without condescension, which she considered relevant information about his character. I said he sounded like someone worth knowing. She said she thought so too. Over the following months, Marcus appeared in our Sunday calls with increasing frequency, not as a subject of romantic discussion, because Lily did not discuss things in those terms, but as a recurring presence in the account of her week. He had suggested a paper she might find useful. They had worked on a project in the same library space for 4 hours without speaking, which she described as comfortable. He had learned, without being told explicitly, that she needed a certain amount of notice before plans changed, and that she preferred direct communication to indirect. And he had simply adjusted his behavior accordingly without making it a conversation. The last detail was the one that told me what I needed to know. A person who observes what someone needs and provides it without requiring acknowledgement or explanation is a particular kind of person, not common, worth keeping. I met Marcus for the first time the following Thanksgiving, when Lily brought him to Millbrook Avenue for dinner. He arrived exactly on time, which I noted. He shook my hand with a grip that was neither aggressive nor tentative, which I also noted. He had brought a bottle of sparkling cider because Lily had told him I did not drink wine, which told me she had been paying attention to the details of introducing him to me, in the same way I imagined she paid attention to everything else. He was 23, broad-shouldered, with the particular quality of stillness that I had only ever seen in people who were genuinely comfortable with silence, not performing calm, but actually inhabiting it. He sat at my kitchen table and talked with me about electrical engineering and about Chicago and about the neighborhood he had grown up in on the West Side. And he listened when I talked about the CTA and the bus routes and the 30 years that had shaped most of what I knew about managing complex systems. At one point during dinner, I watched him pass Lily the salt before she asked for it. She had not looked up from her plate. She had not made any visible gesture. He had simply noticed, from whatever peripheral awareness he maintained of the space around her, that she was about to want it, and he had put it within her reach. I thought about a February night 14 years earlier, sitting on a hardwood floor across the room from a 9-year-old girl who was in pain, reaching my hand toward her without touching, letting her know I was there by simply being there. I thought that Marcus Webb understood something about Lily that most people never learned, and some people spent years failing to learn. He understood that love was not always loud, that care was not always announced, that the most important things you did for another person were sometimes the things they never had to ask for. After dinner, they helped me clear the table, Lily in her methodical way, Marcus adapting to her rhythm without comment, and then they sat in the living room while I made coffee. And I could hear them talking in the low, comfortable way of people who have found a frequency that suits them both. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and listened. It was the sound of Lily being at ease in the world. I had spent 15 years working toward that sound. I had not known, in those early years, if I would ever hear it. There had been nights when I had sat in this kitchen after Lily was asleep and wondered if I was doing enough, if I was doing it right, if the particular kind of child she was would ever find a way to be comfortable in a world that was not designed for the way her mind worked. Standing in that doorway on Thanksgiving evening, listening to my granddaughter talk quietly with a young man who had learned to pass her the salt before she asked. I had my answer. She was going to be fine, not in spite of who she was, because of who she was, and because, perhaps, someone had sat on a hardwood floor with her once when she needed it, and had kept sitting there until she was ready to reach out. Marcus and Lily were married the following June. The wedding was small, 20 people, a ceremony in a garden on the north side, a reception at a restaurant afterward that Lily had chosen because it was quiet, and the lighting was adjustable, and the menu had been decided in advance, so there were no surprises. These were the accommodations that the people who loved Lily made without being asked, because they understood that making them was simply part of knowing her. I wore the navy suit. It was the 3rd time I had worn it. My wife's funeral, the Cook County family court, and now this, a June garden, white chairs, my granddaughter in a dress the color of winter light, standing beside a young man who looked at her the way you look at something you know the value of and intend to protect. I sat in the front row and watched her walk down the short aisle between the chairs, and I thought about the 7-year-old girl with the pink duffel bag, and the 8 years of oatmeal and the February night on the hardwood floor, and the 3 monitors and the navy suit on the back of the bedroom door, and the patent in the top drawer, and the courtroom on West Washington Street, and all of it arriving here, in a garden in June, with this outcome. The officiant asked if anyone had objections. Nobody did. Of course, nobody did. When Marcus said "I do," he said it in the quiet, certain way he said most things, looking directly at Lily. And Lily said it back with the precision she brought to everything she meant completely. I did not cry. I had cried on harder occasions than this one. This occasion did not require it. This occasion required something quieter, a kind of interior acknowledgement, a settling, the feeling of a long piece of work arriving at its final form. After the ceremony, I shook Marcus's hand, and he held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and looked at me and said, "Mr. Hutchins, I want you to know that I understand what you did for her, and I intend to be worthy of it." I looked at him for a moment, then I said, "I know you do, son." And I meant it entirely. That was 4 months ago. They live on the north side now. Lily and Marcus, in an apartment that Lily has arranged according to the logic that is entirely her own, the monitors at the precise angles she requires, the cables organized, the lighting adjustable, the kitchen stocked with the things she will eat and none of the things she will not. Marcus has learned all of it, not because she made him a list, though she may have, but because he paid attention the way people pay attention when they understand that the details matter. They come to Millbrook Avenue for dinner on the second Sunday of every month. This is Lily's system. Not mine. I would not have presumed to establish a schedule without being invited to. But Lily, who has always found comfort in reliable patterns, decided that the second Sunday was the right interval and informed me of it in the particular matter-of-fact way she communicated decisions she had already made. I said that sounded fine. She said good. And every second Sunday since the wedding, they have arrived at 6 o'clock, and I have made dinner, and we have eaten at the table where we ate oatmeal together for 8 years, and then they have gone home. Last Sunday was the second Sunday of October. I made roast chicken, which is what I make when I want the meal to feel like something. Mashed potatoes with no lumps. Green beans cooked until they were soft. The meal Lily had requested for her 16th birthday, which had become, without either of us deciding it formally, the meal that meant occasion in our household. Marcus brought a bottle of sparkling cider and a book he thought I might like, a history of the Chicago transit system that he had found in a used bookstore on Clark Street. He said he thought of me when he saw it. I said he was right too. I put it on the table next to the patent, which I had moved from the oak desk to the living room bookshelf sometime in the past year, in a frame that Patricia Owens had given me as a gift after the trust was finalized. She had said it belonged somewhere visible. I had agreed with her. We ate dinner the way we always ate it, the three of us at the kitchen table. The conversation moving at a pace that suited Lily, which meant it moved at a pace that suited all of us. Marcus had learned this early and had never resisted it. He talked about a project he was working on, a circuit design problem that had been giving him difficulty, and Lily listened, and then offered 3 sentences that resolved the difficulty entirely. And Marcus laughed in the way he laughed when she did this, with genuine delight. Not surprise, because he had stopped being surprised by her a long time ago. After dinner, Marcus washed the dishes without being asked, which he always did, and Lily dried them, which she always did. And I sat at the table with my coffee and watched them standing at the sink together and thought about things that did not require words. At 8:30 they put on their coats. I walked them to the door and out onto the porch. The October evening was cold and clear, the kind of night that makes the stars visible even through the city light. The kind of night that reminds you the world is larger than whatever you have been worrying about. The trees on Millbrook Avenue had gone gold and brown, the same as they were the morning I made the oatmeal, and Gerald Park's phone number sat on the notepad, and the shape was forming in the fog. That was 5 years ago now. Marcus shook my hand on the porch and said goodnight, and went down the steps first. Lily stopped at the top of the steps and looked at me for a moment, the direct look. The one she used when she meant something specifically. She said, "The chicken was good tonight." "Grandpa," I said, "I have had practice." She said, "Yes, you have." She went down the steps, and Marcus put his hand on her back lightly, at the exact place and with the exact pressure that she accepted without stiffening. The particular touch that he had learned was welcome, and they walked down the front path together, toward the car parked at the curb. I stood on the porch and watched them go. The cold air settled around me, and the October trees moved in a light wind, and the stars were out above Millbrook Avenue, and my granddaughter walked away from my house with her husband's hand on her back and her shoulders easy and her head up. I stood there until they reached the car. Marcus opened her door first. Of course he did. She got in, and he closed the door and went around to the driver's side, and I heard the engine start, quiet and smooth. And the headlights came on, and the car pulled away from the curb and moved down Millbrook Avenue and turned at the corner and was gone. I stood on the porch for another moment in the dark. The street was quiet. The house behind me was warm and lit. The patent was on the bookshelf in the living room in its frame. The oak desk was in the study with its top drawer empty of the thing that had defined the last 5 years of my life, and full again of the ordinary papers of an ordinary existence, utility bills and warranty cards, and the small documented residue of a life lived simply and with intention. I thought about my wife. I thought about 30 years of bus routes. I thought about a September evening and a pink duffel bag and a 7-year-old girl staring at a doorstep. I thought about February and a hardwood floor and a hand reached out in the dark, not quite touching mine. I thought about all of it, and then I let it settle into the place where finished things go, not forgotten, not diminished, but completed. Fully and properly completed. I had done what I was supposed to do. The rest was hers. I went back inside and closed the door against the October cold and stood in my hallway in the quiet of a house that was just mine now, which was all right, which was more than all right, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. I turned off the porch light, and I went to bed. If this story meant something to you today, if it reminded you of someone you love, or someone who loved you without needing to say so, or something you have built in the quiet years that turned out to matter more than you knew, then I am grateful you were here to hear it. Please share it with someone who might need it. Leave a kind word if you are moved to, and if you believe, as I do, that the right people find each other when the time is right, and that the work we do in the silent years is never wasted, then perhaps you will come back and listen again. God bless you and everyone you are holding close. Good night.